Hello everyone, hope you guys are doing well. I'm very excited to show you guys the process of this illustration that I did recently. I've been having a bit of a slow start of the year, but thankfully I'm starting to pick up some steam again, and I've been working away at these illustrations recently. This one actually has a sister illustration, which will be the next video that I show you, but as you can see here, it's my character Sweet. Lately I've been just kind of drawing Sweet and Zero a lot, so still following that trend, and there are a bunch of specific parts of this process that I think would be interesting to share with you, specifically things like rendering darker skin on paper with ink, something I've always had trouble in the past with, but I finally figured out a way that seemed to produce pretty good results. But yeah, I managed to capture most of this process, thankfully, and as you can see, the first step for me was to just draw the sketch, and I decided to do that digitally. I do that sometimes for a variety of reasons. In this particular case, I decided to make the sketch digital because I knew that I wanted to do an ornate frame, and some parts of it, or I guess I was planning for the frame to be symmetrical, and it's a lot easier to figure out symmetrical stuff in Photoshop. I've tried to do something like that before on paper once, and it just took a really long time. So long story short, I decided to just sketch it out and print the sketch and transfer it onto the paper using a light box. So as you can see, I have a pure reference board that has all the inspiration that I've gathered for these particular illustrations, this one and the other one that I mentioned at the beginning. I initially started planning this board a while ago because, as some of you may know, I've been working on some sticker packs and I guess just like stationery sets based on a theme. So the previous theme that I finished was the Scholar, and the one I finished beforehand was the Traveler, and unfortunately it takes me like a really long time to pull together these sticker sets, and for the last one I actually also did some washi tapes. So once I was able to complete those, I decided to pick the next theme, and I want this one to be more extensive. So now that I have a little bit of experience with making washi tapes and whatnot, I want to make this set have more merchandise. Long story short. But yeah, as you can see, I'm actually referencing the older sets as well while I'm working on this. And I just want to admit real quick that this piece kind of got away from me. Like, it ended up being way more detailed than I initially anticipated, or that I wanted to make it. I wanted to be a little bit more similar to the first sticker set that I did, which is the Traveler. But for those, I did not do digital sketches, and I worked on a significantly smaller piece of paper when I actually did work traditionally. So this went into a different direction, but I digress. Yeah. So basically I'm kind of starting out on the Astronomer set, and as you can see, I have a bunch of inspirational images there included on the board to help me come up with small details to pull from. Oh, and a quick mention of something I completely forgot about, because I completely fail at running my online shop by never advertising it. So I'm having a big sale right now. Everything is 10 to 25% off. So if you've been wanting to get something from my shop, like the stationery sets that I mentioned or my art book, everything is on sale and will be for about a week. So please check it out if you wanted to support me. Yeah, I don't know how to do advertising, so oh yeah, my shop is cosmicspectrum.art. Thanks for listening to this. So yeah, now back to the video. After I completed the rough sketch, which is, relatively resolved, but I would still say I guess it's kind of on the rough side, I printed it out and I stuck it to the back of a Saunders Waterford 9x12 cold press watercolor paper. I really like this paper, and in the last couple of months I purchased larger pads, so I really wanted to try using it on bigger pieces, and I guess I just jumped the gun and decided to make this a bigger piece, and like I mentioned, it ended up being too detailed, but regardless of that, I am very happy with how it turned out, and I do think that it's one of the better pieces that I've done traditionally in terms of precision and solid finishing. I know that even thinking back a few years ago, this process is not new to me. I've done a lot of traditional artwork, starting with a digital sketch and then transferring it onto paper using a light box. And back in the day, I found myself actually needing quite a bit of Photoshop retouching after I scanned it in. But this time around, I figured a better approach and a more like precise type of workflow that actually allows for very minimal touch-ups. And for this particular piece, I actually didn't really need any touch-up, which is crazy because typically I like to go in and like fix little things that bother me. But yeah, so actually I was kind of working in a bit of a trial and error way with transferring the sketch, not this particular one, but so basically I sketched this one and the other portrait, the one of Zero, the one that I haven't posted yet. I sketched them at the same time, and I did print them out and transfer them onto paper at the same time as well. And I started with the Zero one, and I was feeling super rusty, and it took me forever to like transfer it onto the paper, but I quickly remembered what the proper way of going about it is. And so when I moved on to transferring the Sweet sketch, which is what you're looking at now, I implemented this freshly remembered technique that I seem to have completely lost, even though I've done this like a million times before. And what I'm talking about is basically like going super light on the initial pass and essentially just tracing the basic shapes and elements onto the paper, and then turning off the light box and putting the details in. I know that sounds super straightforward, but I swear, like every time I take a long break from doing traditional art, I just forget that this is how I went about it initially and that this is the best approach. So I start to try to be precise at the very start and put in details at the start, and that always like ends up taking way too long and ends up hurting my eyes because I look at the light box turned on. Anyways, my advice is to do the super simple silhouette and shapes first, and then turn it off and add all the details in afterwards, which is what you see me doing right now. And I would also really recommend using a hard pencil and pressing on it kind of lightly. I personally have an issue with pressing too hard on any tool that I'm using, but I have to work extra hard to like keep the lines light in order to be able to erase them easily afterwards and not damage the paper too much while erasing and actually while drawing, because if you press too hard, it leaves grooves, and then it can look kind of ugly when you put ink on top of it because they become more visible. But yeah, so basically I just put in all the details, and as you can see, I left some of the parts pretty vague, like the embellishments on the border, and was able to easily fill in the details after just indicating where roughly things would be to make sure that everything is still symmetrical. And then when it comes to the flourishes on the frame, I do tend to make up a lot of stuff on the spot and just kind of like, try to make it look the same on both sides, but it's definitely not the same, which is fine because it's not that noticeable anyways, since it's not the most important thing for those elements to be identical on both sides. I don't really sweat it too much. But yeah, at this point, the sketch is pretty much done, and typically what I do is take a kneadable eraser and lightly go over the entirety of the sketch to kind of lift some of it so that when I go to inking, it doesn't smudge. Also, it's easier to differentiate the black lines of the ink pen from the pencil lines. I have noticed that it can be a little bit difficult to control the quality of the line because of the texture on the paper. As you can see, even in the footage, the texture is pretty prominent and the bumps are relatively visible, and thus I think it takes a little bit of extra control to be able to control the lines, or I just said control like 3 times in a row. Anyways, to be precise with the lines, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, but overall I think it's not too bad, and this is one of the reasons actually why I in the past kind of gravitated towards more smooth paper like mixed media paper and hot press watercolor paper. But I really like how this type of paper with the texture, the cold press paper behaves when it comes to putting down large washes of color afterwards, and thus I end up preferring it over the other types of paper that I use. It's a lot easier to get a smooth gradient or just like cover an area with paint or ink smoothly. So that's something I'm gonna go back to actually when I talk about how I managed to render the skin properly for the first time. So I've drawn this character like a bunch of times before. Most of the time I draw her digitally, and unfortunately the couple of times that I tried to draw her portrait mode traditionally, I actually had to scrap those drawings because the skin came out super splotchy and I just was really unhappy with the skin. And that's why, you know, I put in so much time and so much work into this drawing with the line work and the sketching and stuff, and by the time I got to rendering the skin, I was very nervous about it because I was afraid that it was just going to be the same thing again and it's going to end up splotchy and I'll just have to scrap the drawing, which is something I almost never do these days. So when it happens, it's, I don't know, it's very discouraging. But happy to say I managed to figure it out and it turned out well. But yeah, so this is a bit of a lengthy part in the video, but essentially I just further detail all the elements in the drawing by going over the sketch and adding details here and there with the pen. I really like doing multiple sketches because I think it really helps me zero in on the best shapes and to kind of perfect them in the process. I used to not do as many sketch passes because I was lazy, and actually I've done some artwork before where I would ink straight on top of the digital sketch that was taped on the other side of the paper on the light box. That was like kind of hard on my eyes, so I stopped doing that. And I do think that this takes a little bit longer, but it seems to be worth it. And as I have mentioned before in my other videos, I prefer using the G-Nib by Deleter brand. I just bought like a pack of 10 and they honestly last forever, so I would highly recommend that. Also wanted to mention that the ink that I'm using is a diluted mixture of black ink and purple ink. I know that it's kind of difficult to see that because it does look pretty dark in the footage, but I purposefully dilute ink typically because using a using a lighter shade, slightly lighter than black, helps to not flatten out the image so much and also kind of makes the image more cohesive in the end, I find. So for this particular one, I knew the vague color scheme that I was going to go with. I knew that it would have a galaxy background within the frame, and so there would be some blues and purples, and I decided that mixing in purple with black would probably work out, as it will also not interfere with the skin tone. And I do think that was a good call because, as some of you may know if you've seen my other processes, I typically take the same ink that I ink that I mix to the side there, as you can see in the video, and I diluted quite a bit to use that as the shadow base before I put any colors down. And that's actually what you see me doing right now. And so this is where I wanted to talk about rendering the skin. It was kind of scary going into it for me because I wasn't sure how this paper was going to handle big washes and gradients, and also because this is way bigger than I typically work. I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to work fast enough to keep everything smooth and neat looking, and for the most part I was able to get it done, even though it was kind of difficult. So what I've noticed about this paper is that it actually does keep the ink wet longer than the other papers that I've used, the other types of papers that I used before, and that is actually what makes it a little bit easier to do a smooth gradient, as long as you don't let any edges sit for too long. If you just keep pushing the ink outwards and blending it in, and then you can even use a paper towel to pick some of it up in order to create a smooth gradient, or like a smooth transition between the white of the paper and the ink. I do that quite a lot and I think it's super effective, and so I was able to have a smooth shadow layer for the skin, thankfully. And this was kind of tough, but it was not going to be the toughest part, and I knew that, so I I decided to, see how it goes and just add some shadows elsewhere. And before I get to that, I also wanted to mention that I know this is a very meticulous process, but like I've mentioned, I think it really pays off in the end, because I found that after taking my sweet time to make sure everything looks good and like I want it to, I have to do very, very minimal and almost no edits afterwards. And this actually also takes me to the fact that I recently noticed that my scanner sucks. Like, when I take pictures of the finished illustrations, the photos look better than the scanned images, so I think I have to figure out some sort of upgrade situation, because it really is a shame. Like, this illustration just looks so much better in person than it did in the scanned version that I had to just color correct. So yeah, something that I am going to have to figure out how to do, because I don't know, I guess my scanner is pretty old at this point. It's also very small, so I had to like scan this image twice and then use Photoshop photo merge in order to stitch it together, which is actually a super useful tool, by the way. If you guys haven't heard of it before, I would highly recommend using that if you scan images in like multiple times when they're too big for your scanner. It's called photo merge. But yeah, so before I thought I was gonna do the skin first, but obviously I'm doing the background first. So yeah, for that I just picked a couple of colors, and everything that I'm using so far has been ink. I know that it is difficult to tell the difference between watercolor and colored inks. I don't really know exactly what the difference is myself, except for the fact that I think most of the time watercolor picks back up if you wet it after it is dried, whereas colored ink does not. So it's permanent, and once it's dry, there's nothing you can do to pick it back up. So it is a little bit of a less forgiving medium, but if there's some utility in that, I think, because I'm so used to using ink, and once it's dry, it's done. When I tried using watercolors, that actually kind of messed with me, like the fact that it gets picked up afterwards, and that made me have to be extremely careful about choosing which parts to color first. And so that's why I prefer colored ink, because no matter what I choose to render first, it doesn't matter, because it's not going to pick up after, like, even if I go over it by accident in some other part of the process. So yeah, and I actually just pulled out this little shimmer paint that I have, which is the Coliro brand. It's like these pearlescent watercolors. Very nice. Sometimes I use them for accents. They're kind of difficult to see on camera, but look very nice in person. They are pearlescent, and so if you kind of like shift the image around, you can really see different colored shimmers in on different angles. So that's kind of cool. I used that on her eyelid for the eyeshadow and the nails, I believe, as well. But yeah, also wanted to mention that I did a very poor job at planning out the colors before I started working on this piece. I kind of wish that I did a very quick rough color pass in Photoshop, something that I actually want to try doing. I've never done that for pieces that I've sketched digitally and then transferred over, but I think it would actually be very helpful to do that, because for this one in particular, I wasn't entirely happy with the color scheme as I was working on it. I think in the end it turned out decent, but it's actually not exactly what I was going for, and typically I find that pretty upsetting. So I had something more vintagey in mind with more muted tones, but I don't know, I guess I didn't really test out the colors before I started using them, and the entire illustration ended up being very vibrant, and that's not really how I intended it, like I said, but in the end, just gotta roll with it, I guess. But yeah, so finally, this is the part where I'm doing the skin, and I can almost like remember how nervous I was there, because the tone is so much darker than what currently is on paper that I was really afraid to lose that nice and smooth gradient. But thankfully, I think I did a smart thing by positioning the highlights on the face in a way that actually allowed me to break up the different areas in which I did the wash of color. I don't know if that, hopefully that made sense, the explanation, but it's kind of like I knew that I really couldn't put the entire gradient or the entire wash on the whole face all at once, because the area is just too big and there's no way that I could keep pushing the ink without it drying prematurely on me and forming splotches, which is always what happened in the past. But yeah, in this particular case, I kind of thought ahead about it, and I picked some areas that could be divided and tackled separately. So as you can see, this is when I finished putting the color on the skin, and there are some splotches, but it's not that bad because they're in places where I already knew that I could pretty easily cover them up by doing the colored pencil pass, which is usually the last step of illustrations that I take. And that's something kind of new to my process. I only really bought a set of colored pencils last year. I don't remember exactly when. Maybe it was last year, maybe it was the year before, not sure, but it was kind of recently. I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time, so yeah, a year is pretty recent, I guess, in that, from that point of view. But anyways, so I decided to use colored pencils as the finishing step on these inked illustrations because it's kind of similar to what I do digitally. I use line work. As you can see, I'm very dependent on line work. I think it's my strength, and every time I try to stray from it, I just end up remembering that I should stick to what I'm good at, and line work is that thing. So I found that digitally, I will do as much as I can with the line work intact, and then the very last step that I do is putting a layer on top of everything and just painting over the little things that I think could use some polishing. And that's essentially the same thing that I do with the colored pencils. After I put down all the flat colors, I use color pencils to bring in some depth to the shading, add some dark, like make the darks darker, and obviously add some texture, which you probably saw in the final that I showed you in the beginning. And I really, really love the texture thing as well. So the texturization with the diagonal lines is relatively straightforward. You just pick a direction and then you do your best to stick to that direction, which is actually harder than it seems because I tend to be so like mindless when I do this type of stuff. I don't think about it and I work pretty fast without stopping to assess the situation. And so it's very hard for me to make sure that all the diagonal lines go in the same direction. But thankfully in this process, I was able to pause and assess which direction the lines are going and like more or less keep it in the same vein. So yeah, I was kind of experimental when it came to picking the colors for the skin, and I do like how it turned out very rich. I picked some oranges to make it a little bit warmer in certain places, and the yellow, the very pale yellow pencil to pop out the highlights, which I think worked really well with the skin tone. So very happy with how that turned out. And I used like a dark brown to just accentuate the darker areas some more. That's mostly what I do with colored pencils, to just like push the darks further and sculpt everything, if that makes sense. Pretty much did the same thing with the frame afterwards as well. And I just want to quickly say that I ran into this issue when I was working on the hair, that I could not find a gray pencil that was the right shade, because you can't really tell in the footage, but the gray that I used has purple mixed into it, so it's black and purple, really diluted, so it did have this warm purpley tinge to it. And I did not have any gray pencils that match that at all. All of them are very cool toned, and I found they were just too dark. And I mean, I guess I picked one that just kind of worked, but I really wish I had more of a selection. So that's kind of the issue with colored pencils. I find that like even though I have the biggest set of colors, I still often find that I don't have the exact color that I'm looking for, unfortunately. But you know, it's okay. I guess part of the fun is just trying to work around the problem with what you have. There's the dark pencil that I ended up picking for the hair, and Yeah, it's just a dark gray. Didn't really add anything, and that's actually part of the reason why I went very easy on the hair and I didn't overdo it. And I think actually in the end that was kind of a good decision, because there's so many details scattered around this entire drawing that maybe it's for the best that the hair isn't too detailed. Also wanted to mention that I used a silver ink for the stars that you see in the background. I really love this ink. I think it's a Winsor & Newton ink, and it works super well. It's very opaque and relatively good in texture, so it doesn't get stuck in the nib. I'm pretty much near the finish here, and while I was editing this, I actually realized that I did not, for some reason, record the very last few minutes of this painting / drawing, in which I pulled out some acrylic gouache paints that I have, just black and white, because I kept adding on top of her eyelashes and her eyeliner, just trying to make it darker, but it wouldn't go any darker, and I decided that maybe the paint is what I need to make it as dark as I wanted, and it totally worked. The acrylic gouache black color is super opaque and it's very matte, so it's not reflective, and as you can see here, it came out super dark. And obviously I used the white to just put in a little bit more detail into the hair. And that's the finished sweet astronomer portrait. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one, which I already told you what it will be.